Hello, everyone. How's everybody doing this evening? Good? Well, thank you all for coming to this talk, Afrofuturism and Social Change in Black Panther, Film as Political Education. You know I'm Dr. Christopher Tula, and this event was made possible with the generous funding of the College of Arts and Media's EDI grant funding program. And just let me take a moment to introduce our speaker, Dr. Dominique Thomas of Morehouse College. If my phone will reorient so that the text is actually large enough for me to read. Dominique Thomas is an adjunct faculty member in psychology at Morehouse College and the current editor of The Community Psychologist. He received his BA in psychology from Morehouse College, his PhD in community psychology from Georgia State University, and completed his postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Michigan and the National Center for Institutional Diversity. He has also been a consultant, program evaluator for community-based organizations and educational institutions, and served as an editor for numerous journals, newsletters, and scholarly essays. Dr. Thomas has published articles and book chapters on topics such as education, socialization, identity, Afrofuturism, politics, and media. He is co-editing a forthcoming special issue in the American Journal of Community Psychology titled Imperial Algorithms, Contemporary Manifestations of Racism and Colonialism. Please give a warm Sam Houston welcome to my colleague and friend, Dr. Dominique Thomas.
Hello, everyone. As I said, my name is Dominique Thomas. I actually got the day. All right.
They're talking with the mic on? No?
I can't hear
But you wouldn't be doing this.
Right.
Should I redo the introduction, Jonathan, or can we ADR it later?
You have such good production.
I know I'm loud. I'm on something.
Okay. So today I'll be talking about Afrofuturism and social change in Black Panther. So just a bit of an overview. So I'll introduce how science fiction is often a way in which we see different critiques of society, and I'll also talk about some of the themes and concepts related to Afrofuturism, and how we can use Afrofuturism to imagine different modes of being, so different ways of engaging in politics, different ways to think about ethics and law, and just looking at Black Panther in general as both pedagogy and allegory. So in terms of how we can look at Black Panther as something to learn from, but also how the story itself can be allegorical for a lot of historical things, but historical phenomena that have happened over the centuries and millennia. And in many ways, like the story of Wakanda is an archetypal story of many societies across history. So in a lot of science fiction, there's a bit of societal critique. So an example I'm showing you is from the movie Dune that just recently came out. And a part of Dune's social criticism is the idea of charismatic leaders and how you always need to be careful with charismatic leaders because they can in a sense be the downfall of both societies and different social movements if you become too reliant on charismatic figures. And then we have Star Trek, which presents us with both a somewhat utopian view of the future, but also showing the ways in which we still have to account for different societal problems, even in what seems like utopia. And then we have the Matrix. So, what is the nature of reality? Like, how do our systems keep us enslaved in different ways that we are not aware of? And red pill, blue pill, like, do you decide to remain asleep, or do you decide to go down a rabbit hole in terms of figuring out, like, what are the fundamental problems with your society? And what does that do to a person when they have this awakening or this enlightenment when you realize that the world that you lived in is not what you thought it was? So a lot of these ideas play a role in Afrofuturism. So this could be looked at as a project that's invested in cultural, aesthetic, political, and ontological transformation. So just think of ways of transforming society and coming from a perspective that's rooted both in history but also in speculation. So it's also a speculative movement that fuses science fiction, speculative art and cultural criticism. So it becomes a useful way of rethinking the past, present, and future. And this was initially a literary movement that's since expanded into more of a philosophical movement in terms of rethinking how we both engage in storytelling, but also use these methods to come up with new ways of being and to transform society. And it's a way of incorporating both cultural aspects of Africa's past while also keeping in mind the current issues that we face today in society, like a lot of things that are happening with increasing technological advances, and also intervention into the future, because a lot of what we see in science fiction or future is typically very like Eurocentric. Like you don't really see a lot of black people in a lot of science fiction media in the future. And in some ways, if they are there, like they're just kind of there. There's nothing that's culturally significant about what roles they play. It's just, oh, but there's a black person there, but you don't see the ways in which black culture or African culture hasn't been able to survive into those futures. So I look at a movie like Mad Max and I wonder, like, were all the black people in Mad Max? Y'all know y'all had those same questions too when you watch the movie. I asked people nod in their heads. But it's an intervention because what happens when you're not imagining the future? What happens when all plans of the future seemingly don't include you? Do you think does that make you feel like there's a place for you in that future? When all these futures are like being proposed by like the Elon Musks and Jeff Bezos of the world, all of these big technocrats, all of the people who are given the authority to say, this is what the future of humanity should be. But what does that mean when these big brains come up with all of these futures that leave out so many people? And these are the types of questions that Afrofuturism grapples with, especially when, in a lot of ways, people of the African diaspora have been placed into scenarios in which their futures weren't thought about, or in many instances, they were not even expected to have futures. So we think about transatlantic slave trade, like, were those people's futures thought about in that scenario? Or in the sense that they can be thought to be used as free labor, or have some other thing like extracted from their communities in some form. But it's in the service of someone else's future, not their own. And when we talk about Afrofuturism, one thing that comes up is how life can be a bottom-up, self-generating diversity of processes. So coming from like a generative framework, you can think of life as being any number of different things that can arise out of a beginning. How best to like describe this? So think of how Wakanda emerged as kind of a bottom-up, self-generating process. So you have the story of the meteor striking Wakanda, and then the people in the different tribes of Wakanda coming together and finding this vibranium, but then they decide, okay, we need to figure out some like system of people, someone to follow in order to best manage this resource that we have now like come across. So it was, in a sense, though Wakanda was birthed out of something that was self-generating or was of the people, because the different tribes came together and decided that, okay, we're going to agree to follow this one person because they have some level of access to information to help us best use this resource. So it's a way in which they themselves came up with their structures and it wasn't imposed on them by a person. And one way of thinking about this is a term called techno-vernacular creativity. So it's essentially the ways in which you can use science, technology, and cultural art to come up with new ways of being. So think about hip hop. So think about how hip hop has tended to reuse and remix and reappropriate different art forms in order to make something new. So when you listen to hip hop, say Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, you hear all the influence of jazz, blues, you hear rock, you even hear gospel. Like if you listen to the Pimple Butterfly, you could really look at it as like a hood gospel album, the way it's put together, and the different themes that Kendrick is talking about in his music, like religion, sexuality, death, all the different problems that we think about and try to make meaning of in our life. And we see how culture can generate a lot of different information from all these intersections of technology, art, science, culture, economic storytelling, and a lot of ways that culture can be the framework or the baseline for creating new things or creating new ways of being. So when we think about different technologies, they're not just like random inanimate objects that just do things, but they are active forces that actively shape our lives. So you think about something like the internet, that's something that has actively shaped and warped like the world in which we live in. Like, can anyone remember what life was before the internet? And the only reason that these people are raising their hands is because they were born before what we think of as the internet, me included. So you don't know a world before the internet, like dial-up. What y'all know about the dial-up? Or those AOL CDs that you used to get free internet for like a couple of days and then you had to use another one. Like these are the things that people were doing to like get internet access before it was super like accessible to like the common person. So, you know, that's like an example of how technology has so like shaped and transformed our world that it's unrecognizable to people who lived in a previous time period, and the time period that was before this would look foreign and unfamiliar to anyone who's born in this time, right? So we could also think about Afrofuturism as a way to read resistance. So understanding resistance not just through our standard like terms of thinking about how people resist, but thinking about it in new ways. So different forms of resistance that have happened over the course of centuries, and using those as ways to rethink how we can engage in social change. So taking strategies that have actually been used in the past and bringing them forward into the future, or bringing them into a new timeline in order to figure out new ways of opposition or of becoming. And there's an interesting concept of like black rebel cyborgs in an article that was referencing like how to think about resistance. And this is a quote: "To be black in a world that is structured by violent anti-blackness is to be a cyborg." So think about how, we're gonna go back to like slavery idea, but think about how people were viewed as machines. Not as humans, but as machines. So in a strange way, like it is in a sense being made into a cyborg because you are a human being, but you're also being forced to perform as a machine. So it's like a hybrid identity that you take on as being both man and machine because of what you're being forced into. And the ways in which colonization placed blackness outside of what's considered human. Like think of all, and there was so much social science and medical science that was basically created to justify black people being enslaved. And this isn't even just for black people. Like there's a lot of different peoples that have been subjugated and oppressed and had some type of academic or scientific rationale like given to justify it. So just think of the ways in which people who have been placed outside of the bounds of what's considered human have had to actually navigate and live through the world when they're not being given that status of human. And related to this is the idea, this actually comes from a Public Enemy song, Armageddon been in effect. So it's also a way in which you think about slavery, colonialism, and all these other types of events as their own types of apocalypses. We tend to think about an apocalypse as something like that's in the future, that's to come. But we don't think about the different apocalypses that have actually happened already. And the term apocalypse reference is actually means like an unveiling or revealing. So when we think about the apocalypse of like slavery and colonialism, what was happening at the same time? That Enlightenment. So like the Enlightenment period was happening at the same time as colonialism, as transatlantic slave trade. All that's happening at the same time. So you see both Enlightenment as positive, but you also see like the dark side of Enlightenment as apocalypse, because something else was revealed to people too in that time period, which was man's inhumanity to man at the worst level. So people who have to navigate these systems that are so oppressive and in which they're not viewed as human, they have their own knowledge of being in that space of not being a citizen. And what different strategies and techniques do you have to use in order to live in a society in which you have no citizenship rights and you're not even considered to be human. So the Dred Scott case, 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that the white man was not bound to respect any rights that the black man supposedly had. So what knowledge do you gain from being in those situations in which you have law, science, and all other forms of intellectual authority saying you don't count? And how many different new and radical formations do people have to come up with when they're placed in this type of scenario in which you essentially have to create new ways of being human, because the current ways in which humanity is defined somehow for some reason leave you out. So a concept I like to think about as it relates to Afrofuturism is Sankofa. So this is actually the Sankofa bird, and the bird is looking backwards because the bird looks backward to bring forth the seed of a new future. Let us go back to the past to fetch that which is useful for the future. So you can see how this is also in line with Afrofuturism. So taking from the African past and bringing forth things that are useful for today. So how do we create new modes of being? How do we learn from the past? So, an example, how do we engage in economic systems that are more cooperative rather than competitive? How do we think of justice in a way that's more restorative than punitive? How do we view ourselves as in relation to one another? Do we view ourselves as separate entities that are totally disconnected, or are we all part of a greater whole? Which is the concept of Ubuntu. I am because we are because I am. Or like Ma'at from ancient Egypt, or as they refer to themselves, Kemet, like the ideas of what represents cosmic and social justice. And also other different African societies across history, and learning from different political structures and philosophical ideas that have come from Africa across history. So when we talk about Black Panther itself, like you can see in the movie how it can be used to both teach about, as both pedagogy and as like an allegory. So you could look at it in terms of an allegory for how societies handle different problems like civil war, or should they engage in imperialism or just humanitarian aid. So a lot of the questions that have come up for many societies across history come up in this movie. So you can look at Wakanda in many ways as an archetypal state, and the ways in which, and I'll get into like the idea of Black Panther as like a god image like later, but the way in which like it's centered around one main product, which is vibranium, and the ways in which economies can also play a role in how societies end up organizing themselves. So, vibranium is like the strongest metal in the world, and Wakanda's society and economy is very much centered around vibranium. And we can also see in different ways how Wakanda can be both a story about African civilizations and societies, but also it could be a story about how America conducts itself too. I mean, just because they are in Africa doesn't mean that the story doesn't have some significance for how Americans conduct themselves too, especially for us who descend from Africa but live in America. And then also how the ancestral plane is like a form of a collective conscious or a collective unconscious that you end up accessing in order to gain deeper knowledge of your society and how to best, in the case of the Black Panthers, be good rulers. Okay, so with Wakanda as an archetypal state, there's an idea of cosmogony playing a role in political philosophy. So what that essentially means is the way in which you think the universe comes into being is going to have an impact in the way in which you think you should organize your society. So if you have a certain understanding of the way the world came to be, you're going to have a particular way that you're going to think that you should put your society together. So an example of this would be like the Black Panther. So the Black Panther is like the ruler, but it's also the representative. The Black Panther is also the representative of the Panther guys. Fast. So you can see different examples from African society of how they organize their society around these types of ideas. So with the Dogon people, they look at man or humans as the cosmic word made flesh. So essentially, like, human beings are the universe manifest. And they even structure their villages based on the human anatomy. So the houses and different buildings in the village are actually shaped in such a way that it's a human shape. And then with the Yoruba, you also have like the Orisha. So these would be what you think of as gods or spirits of the Yoruba. And in many ways, the Black Panther is himself like an Orisha because he really has superpowers that are endowed by, you can think of it as being endowed by the vibranium itself or the more mythological understanding that's given to us at the beginning of the film, in which he has a vision from the Panther goddess. And then the Panther goddess tells him through the vision where to find the heart-shaped herb. So you can see in many ways how the society is based both on a physical resource that they need to survive, but also there's mythology in it too, in terms of how the Black Panther has legitimacy to rule. Because the Black Panther was originally a shaman who had a vision, and because they were a shaman who had this vision and its access to the collective unconscious, the 5 tribes, except for the Jabari, so really on 4, decided to unite and follow essentially this shaman priest. And then you can talk about different philosophies that are embedded within a society like Wakanda. And in many ways, Wakanda is based off of a number of different African societies in history. So they didn't just like make up stuff to like make Wakanda. Like there is history that they're drawn from in different historical African societies that were influences in creating the fictional Wakanda. So we can kind of see this philosophy in the movie too, about, you know, spirituality. Spirituality is like really big in the movie, even though it's something that's not outwardly like stated, but it's really deep in the movie, like the idea of, you know, connecting with your ancestors. And also like what happens when you are disconnected with your ancestors? Like what kind of harm does that do to you spiritually? Like we literally see Eric going into the ancestral plane, but he's not in the open field like T'Challa is. He's stuck in his same apartment when he was a little boy. And we also see, you know, cosmology. So what do you think is the structure of reality? And there's this idea of being at one with nature, and there's interdependence and collectivism. So we wonder how a society like Wakanda could economically thrive with really only one type of main resource that their society is totally structured around. But maybe it's because we live in a society in which it's so competitive and so hyper like capitalistic, it's hard for us to think of a society in which there's not so much competition, in which they would share and distribute like a resource seemingly equitably. You only get so much information about Wakanda in the movie, So until we see more, like, there's still got to be said about how much it is an actually equal society. Like, we also see the different values that are placed in terms of emphasis on person-to-person relations and extended family structure. So ways in which both T'Challa, while also incorporating his sister, who was a part of the story, and his mother, and other family members too. And why it's so bad that what happened at Eric happened, because they literally left one of their own. And that's the tragedy of it. Like, he wasn't, when he shows up, they're like, oh, you're a stranger, but that's only because he was left behind and no one knew who he was. So the importance of extended family structure also demonstrates why Eric has the life that he has, because his extended family literally left him behind in America. And you see what ends up happening to him down the line. You also have like the respect of elders, so the roles in which, so the Queen Mother is still a very powerful role in Wakanda, even though she's older. So, and when you see the different scenes in the movie where it's the council that's talking, you see a lot of older people on the council, and they definitely are listened to. You know, the woman who says, we don't need a warrior, we need a king. Like, you can tell that people listen to her. The way, you can tell that people listen to her, and what she says, like, actually matters. Even down to when T'Challa is thinking about bringing back Ross after, like, after he essentially sacrifices himself to save Nakia. What would the council think? So even T'Challa isn't going to just like randomly go off and do some stuff without actually thinking about what the other members of the council are going to do, because there's a respect for the elders, and as far as he's concerned, those people are actually his elders, right? Because he was literally a prince coming into the role. So, and then we think about like different ways that we can understand and know reality. So feelings and so emphasizing that feelings and like logic matter. So it's not that one is more important than the other, but you have to have a synthesis of both in order to have a deeper understanding of things. So what we feel does have value, which is not to say that like you can't think logically, which logic does matter. Clearly in like Wakanda, logic matters because they need to figure out how to exploit that vibranium somehow, right? But intuition is legitimate, so it's also legitimate. And we kind of see how in the society, these different ideas and ways of thinking about the world come out. So, groupness. So we think about how, what's everybody's favorite phrase from the movie? Wakanda forever. So it's about Wakanda. It's about the group. So when W'Kabi asked Okoye at the end, like, would you really heal me? And she says, for Wakanda, without question. Because it wasn't about her relationship, it was about the country. It's about the people. And this is why the Dora Milaje ended up overthrowing Eric Killmonger, because at the end of the day, he wasn't good for the people. And in terms of thinking back to, now drawing back actual history. So, going to go through a bit of like a historical archaeology of Black radical tradition. So, the Black radical tradition is essentially a shared philosophy from the African past. So, these are all the different ways across the diaspora that Black people have engaged in resistance and liberation efforts, whether it's through outright revolt or literally just running away from the plantations and finding somewhere else to settle and to create a new community. And even though like a lot of this was attempted to have to be stamped out by slave owners and others, the Africans did bring their cultures with them. So the importance of the extended family, like we still see versions of this even now to this day about the importance of extended families in Black communities. So, you know, play cousins, which I think anybody got play cousins, Or yes, you got play cousins, you got aunties who aren't actually your biological aunties, but they're your mama best friends, or just people who are just brought in as part of the family, or they're fictive kin. They're not related, they're not blood related, but they family. They family just the same. So we see this idea of the extended family surviving even through slavery. It's a resilient idea, right? And something else that even predates America as an idea is black marriage. So this is black people who escaped from plantations and went and settled and established their own communities. So one example of this is the Palmares in Brazil. So this was an agrarian community of settlements of both formerly enslaved Africans who escaped from the plantations in Brazil and created their own independent societies. But unfortunately, because these societies essentially exist as evidence against the plantation order, they had to be stamped out because you don't want people getting ideas, right? You don't want people getting the bright idea that they can leave the plantation and set up their own community somewhere and actually live life. Like, what? And this is why, and this is why it's important to know this history, because there was always resistance. People never just sat down and just took it, even though that's the story that tends to get that's been promoted like too much, like the docile enslaved person who's just boldly hoping that God is going to come deliver them from slavery. Like, no, like some people were waiting for God, but some people also were like, God told me I need to go out of here. Like Nat Turner, like that's an example of somebody who thought that who wasn't saying that God's going to deliver us. He said, no, we're going to just do stuff. And so you have the Stono Rebellion in 1739. You have the Haitian Revolution. Chris was just talking about the Haitian Revolution, and how like the Haitian Revolution itself is cited as a bad example. So when the Haitians overthrew the French and kicked them out of Haiti, all the Western powers looked around and were like, we need to do something, because they saw that just happened to France. And if we don't get our stuff in order here, they're going to do the same thing to us here, so we need to piss in the bud. So American slave owners were actually very scared of another Haiti happening. And black people actually celebrated the Haitian independence like during celebrations like yearly too. So that also scared them, because it's like, oh no, they actually saw what happened and now they're celebrating it. Oh no, they might get the idea that they're going to do the same thing. So more repression happened because of that. And also with the different colonial powers conspiring to essentially shut Haiti out of the world economy and force them to pay France back the equivalent of $21 billion in today's money, basically. They were forced to pay back France because they had the nerves to free themselves. Like that is like really think about that. They freed themselves, but then they were forced to pay the people who enslaved them. Somebody make it make sense. And then when like rebellion isn't free, when open rebellion isn't practical, things like Obeah, Voodoo, Christianity, Islam, and other forms of spirituality and religion become ways that people hold on while they can figure out something like more practical in terms of rebellion. So you can't always like openly rebel against the system. Sometimes you have to pick and choose your spots, and sometimes you don't have enough people like in order to make something happen. So this is why, even though it happened in Haiti, it didn't necessarily happen here in the United States, because in Haiti, the people who were enslaved like vastly outnumbered the people who were enslaved. So you talk about maybe like 9, 10 to 1 in some instances, or it was so much, so the difference between the numbers was so much, as opposed to here in America where the numbers weren't in our favor as much, and people are separated across a larger region of land, because Haiti's a small island, whereas you're talking about the American Deep South and people being split across that wide ranging area. So it becomes easier for people in a place like Haiti to communicate and to strategize and to come together because they're closer together. Like where each group of people is located is closer together, and it's easier to communicate because you don't have to travel as far. So it's also just different ways in which, when you better understand the history of events, you see why things happen there and not here. Because I actually got the people, I have a friend from Haiti, he was asked like, why is it like this here? Like, y'all got BET, y'all got this, y'all got that. And I'm like, one, it's not like BET is actually owned by black people, so there's that. Two, like, we were kind of outnumbered here. Like, y'all had mountains and stuff to hide in over there. Like, yeah, like the whole geography was different in a lot of places than what was here in the American South. So there's geographical differences, there's demographic differences in terms of how many people were enslaved versus how many people were owners. So there's always rebellion and resistance, but it takes reading deeply to see where the rebellion and resistance comes from, because it's not always something that can be just out in the open. And back to spirituality. So what role does spirituality play in social transformation? So consciousness is not adequate by itself to liberate people. It has to be empowered. So it's not just enough to know that something is wrong, but you have to actually be empowered in some type of way to make the change, to do the effort. Like, what actually gets you up in the morning? What actually gets you up in the morning and keeps you going day in and day out in these systems, fighting these systems, maintaining some sense of mental stability to fight? So I think about people like Fannie Lou Hamer, so great civil rights activist from Mississippi, where I'm from. And she had like a deep spiritual background from being raised in the church and using that to both empower her in terms of giving her motivation and keeping her on the path, but also as a way in which she used different, but also as like rhetorical device. So she didn't just use spirituality as motivation, she also used like stories from the Bible, parables from the Bible in order to demonstrate her arguments. So in many ways, she looked at herself as like a prophet for social change. And you go to someone else like Bell Hooks, she talked a lot about the role of spirituality and how spirituality is important, both in terms of how we relate to one another and like social change. Martin Luther King Jr., I mean, the Reverend, that doesn't need any more saying, but his foundation was also in the spiritual background, and that was the ways in which he understood and framed his philosophy. And Malcolm X too, like spirituality and religion was something that saved him. Like before then, he was Detroit Red, running around pimping and doing what else? That's literally from his accounts. Like, I'm not just saying, but like, you know, he's doing all this like stuff. He gets thrown in jail. He has this moment where he becomes a member of the Nation of Islam, and there's a way in which his rage at the system is now directed. So it also becomes a way in which people can channel their energy into something more productive and less destructive. Which gets me to MLK's idea of creative maladjustment. So he gave a speech to the American Psychological Association in 1967. And in this speech, he talks about being maladjusted to injustice. And he refers to a cosmic discontent that people experience in these systems of oppression. So he essentially repurposed or remixed psychological maladjustment to make an ethical point. So he posits it as physical and psychological pain is actually indicative of what's going on in the world, and can be a way to signal you that something's off and that something needs to be changed or improved upon. And this creative maladjustment can also be a motivation to protest. And protest isn't just people like in the streets, but it's also an active coping mechanism with the world, because protest is your way of making yourself heard and of actively coping with and addressing the problem at hand. You're not avoiding the problem, you're actively coping and dealing with the problem if you're protesting. So I'll just share this quote. I'm sure that we all recognize that there are some things in our society, some things in our world to which we should never be adjusted. There are some things concerning which we must always be maladjusted if we are to be people of goodwill. Racial discrimination and racial segregation, religious bigotry, economic conditions that take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, the madness of militarism, and the self-defeating effects of physical violence. And I go back to these historical figures because in a way it is going back into like the collective unconscious and recovering the thoughts and the words of these ancestors now, because they're all now like with the ancestors. So when we talk about the collective unconscious, psychologically speaking, this is, quote, the collective unconscious is best understood as the sum of all the behavior patterns we inherit with our DNA. So in many ways, when someone says something like your ancestors are in your DNA, collective unconscious, like all the things that get passed down through families, through DNA, even like some of the basic things that we do as humans get passed down through DNA. And also like the collective unconscious as well too. So when we talk about archetypes, these are essentially the building blocks of your psyche, the basic blueprint. So now I'm going to go back to the idea of the Black Panther as a god of self-image. So when they say something is a god or a self-image, it's essentially an outward representation of what the self is supposed to be psychologically. So we talk about like superheroes a lot. So superheroes are like essentially archetypes of the self. So the epitomes of like what people should be, like what you should strive to be, like a full self in many ways. So you see in the MCU how many individual characters reach like that self-actualization stage where they become like their best selves, like, and it looks different for different people. Like you could say that Tony Stark's like self-actualization was when he, at the end of Endgame.
No.
I mean, because what was the thing that Captain America said to him in the first Avengers movie? You're not the guy that laid it down on the line. You're not the guy who's going to like sacrifice himself to save others. But what did he do? And in many ways, and like the Black Panther himself, like the Black Panther is like an image of like what the ideal person is supposed to be, which is really important for him because he's literally a king. So in many ways, he has to both be a good man as a king, but also be a good man because of what the Black Panther itself is supposed to represent. And typically, like within like psychoanalysis, like the God image is typically overlaps with like the self image because in many ways, what you think of as God is basically what you think of as like the best version of like what you could ever possibly be if you even get to that point. And with the ancestral plane or collective unconscious, it's something that's cultural, acquired, and socialized. So in many ways, you may have been socialized into behaviors or things without people necessarily knowing that's what they were doing. So I study racial socialization, and these are the messages that parents give to their children about race and how to navigate potential problems related to that. And a lot of socialization, while it is like intentional, some of it may not be intentional. Some of it could be from kids watching their parents navigate life or to do different things. So it could be what the parents are telling their children intentionally, but it could also be the children watching what their parents are doing and watching how their parents react to things. So this is how something can be cultural, acquired, and socialized. And these different archetypes can be engaged through myth. So the beginning of Black Panther is essentially like a story of the birth of Wakanda, why the Black Panther is. So that's the way in which that archetype is engaged with the myth. There's all the ritual that goes into it. So you see when Challenge Day, that's a ritual that essentially legitimizes who the Black Panther is going to be in this prayer, in this dance, poetry. We see all these different, we see different versions of this throughout the movie in Wakanda society and how they engage with like the Black Panther as both like this archetype, but also as this political and social figure that they have to follow. And we can kind of see how you could look at this in terms of in terms of like say Eric as an individual, but then you can also look at it in terms of the role he plays like within his family and how that in turn impacts his role within that society. So because he as an individual was left behind by his family, he is not only distant and isolated and alienated from his family, but he is also distant, isolated, and alienated from Wakandan society. So think back when Njoku talks to Eric in the ancestral realm, and he's like, I should have took you back sooner. Because he realized that he should have actually, at some point, taken him to meet his Wakandan family so he could actually be a part of Wakandan society. And maybe he would have gone down a different path if he would have been able to be connected to Wakanda in like as much as he possibly could have been. But because he wasn't, he goes down a much more dark and destructive path. So he has like the Wakanda knowledge that he gets from his father, but because he never actually goes to Wakanda, it's all theoretical. What he knows in his bones is what he lived through here. And ways to different ways of thinking about these archetypes. You can also see how different mythologies come up based off of the languages that people have used and how those all play a role in how we come to view and understand reality. So, I give an example of one mythology, like the Egyptian mythology. So, if you kind of with Osiris and Isis, if you look at you almost can see like the Osiris myth in some ways coming up. So, you know, if Eric is the evil god Set, T'Challa himself would be like Osiris. Set kills or overthrows Osiris, and then Osiris has to be reborn as Horus to then overthrow like Set. So you can kind of see T'Challa being killed in one point, having to be resurrected, and then he comes back to actually be Killmonger the second time around. So it's almost, you can see bits and pieces of different like mythologies wrapped up in the story of Wakanda. I mean, not even just like African mythology, but Hamlet. Black Panther is basically Hamlet. Like sit and think about it. Like if you ever read Hamlet, who's Hamlet? Eric. Eric is Hamlet. Eric is the one who's out for revenge to avenge his father's death, to take out the king who he feels is responsible for his father's death. And then what happens to him? His quest for vengeance ends up destroying himself. So Black Panther is not even just like an archetypal story of like African society, but it's like an archetypal story just in general because we see something like Hamlet, we see something like the Osiris myth like coming up in a movie like Black Panther that has all these different influences. And with these different influences and how Wakanda tries to answer a lot of questions that different societies have grappled with over time, we see different perspectives posed in the movie by three different characters. So we have Eric, who wants to engage in armed revolution to overthrow the oppressors, in his words. We have T'Challa, who's more of an isolationist, who's like, I'm King Wakanda, so I'm worried about Wakanda. We staying out of all that other stuff. which is basically what comedy stands for like the last however many centuries. And then you have the kid who's like, no, we need to actually like engage in humanitarian aid and help the world because we have all these different resources that other people need. Like, why wouldn't we just go out and help people? And we see different historical examples of what like different paths this can go. So we have revolutions. We have the Haitian Revolution, as I mentioned, but you know, we also have the French Revolution, which actually inspired the Haitian Revolution. And then we have the American Revolution as well too, which was happening around the same, which happened a little bit before the Haitian Revolution really got started. So like those first three revolutions are all happening within like the same century, within the same like 30 or 40 years, right? So that's a whole lot of like upheaval happening like all at once within a short span of time, relatively speaking. And then you have like the Russian Revolution, which is at the beginning of the 20th century. So, you know, what happens when you have these autocratic rulers and, you know, they get you in a war and what do? They decide to get rid of them. But then you have American isolationism as like another historical example of one of these paths that a society can go. But in terms of, so you have American isolationism in terms of, you know, American society, we're not going to get involved in other things. But as you know, that hasn't always been the case. And as it relates to humanitarian aid, I'm inclined to agree with Nakia, but I also think about Malcolm X's critique about this. So he critiques American humanitarianism as possibly leading to a philanthropic imperialism or benevolent colonialism. So in ways in which, like, America may use humanitarian aid in order to force countries to do what they want. So if we decide to give you all this aid, you might put strings attached to it. So if we even see this with we see this post-colonialism with different African societies who had gotten out of the yokes of like colonial powers, but in order to be integrated into the world economy, they had to meet certain conditions. And these conditions happen to be set by the same people who they try to free themselves from. So you have things like, if someone's more knowledgeable in this area, let me know. Like structural loans, right? So countries essentially, to get loans, to get their economies back right, they have to structure their economies based off of certain conditions. And oftentimes those conditions aren't actually beneficial for the people who live in those countries. They're more beneficial for the other countries like in the global economy because a lot of those societies, their infrastructures were made to extract wealth from them, not to keep the wealth like amongst the people. So it ends up being replicated in these new structures in terms of, oh, we're going to help you develop, but the strings that are attached to them essentially have them doing the same things that they were doing as colonized countries, but now they're just part of the global economy. So that's the way in which those are examples in which philanthropy can come back to bite different nations because there's strings attached. And this isn't something that was explicitly brought up in the movie, but it is one to think about, which is democracy versus monarchy. Like, so we think about like the instability that was caused when you have a monarch who has like such power and they can't be trusted with that power because of their own problems. And this is why I brought up Dune at the beginning of the movie as like a critique of the charismatic leader, because you see what happens when charismatic leaders go wrong. You get civil wars, societies implode, like people get wrapped up around like the charismatic leader without realizing that they're supposed to be there for like a greater purpose. So, you know, when the Dora Milaje turn on Eric at the end of the movie, that's them saying no to this charismatic leader stuff in a sense because it shouldn't be about him, it's about the people. Now you got to question whether or not they're still following the charismatic leader because they chose T'Challa. That could be a thing to sit on too, but as it relates to democracy and kingship, are the two always actually in opposition to one another? like always, like diametrically opposed. So with democracy, it has to be representative, accountable, and participatory. And it's something that has to grow from like the local roots. Like if it's democracy, it's not something that's imposed on people, right? Because if it's the power of the people, then it has to actually be the power of the people, not the power of someone who comes up with rules and then says, okay, this is democracy, you all gotta do what I say. And going back to the different values that I talked about earlier, as it relates to African worldviews, you see how African social organization is undergirded by this solidarity. So I talked about earlier how person-to-person relations, the interconnectedness of everyone being tied to one another. I am because we are because I am. These ways of promoting solidarity that are possible, that could be actually in a society that has a king, and that could be a way to check that king. So another aspect that's important for this is consensus seeking. So this would be the hallmark of traditional political decision making. So in these societies with like these, in some traditional African societies that had kings, there was a consensus deliberation process. So it wasn't necessarily the king himself or the monarch herself who like made the final decision. It was a leadership unit as a whole. So this could be the different council members or different representatives who are part of like this overall leadership council. So the individual king doesn't have like a final say. And this type of governance would be considered a communocracy. So this would be governance based off of general community involvement and participation. So while there is a king, people still actually participate within the goings-on of society, and the king is more so just essentially the president, like, if you really think about it. And this is also the problem we use, like, English words with English definitions to talk about society that existed, like, in other areas of the world, because we may tend to impose our understanding of the words that we're using onto other societies when they may not have actually when they weren't even speaking the same language and definitely weren't actually using the same words. So how can you really know that you're talking about the same thing? So we have historical examples of this type of governance structure. So you have the Zulu, the Buganas of Uganda, and the Akans of Ghana. So the Akans of Ghana were an example I really thought about because the ways in which the ruler, the first like heroic ruler, Osei Tutu, he combined spiritual divination with temporal power to like coalesce the different groups of people into like a strong fighting force. So you can see how the Akan came together as a predecessor to what happens with Wakanda, how the Wakandans coalesced around a spiritual leader who then like united the tribes and created like this great like society. And with the role that the king plays, the king isn't king because he's divinely ordained, like with divine rule, like in like European monarchies. They're the king because it's by the grace of the people. So you can't really be king if the people don't accept you. So we see a version of this in the movie, The Challenge. So each tribe could essentially send somebody to challenge Wakanda, challenge the Black Panther if they don't accept him. And you can kind of see, like, in the movie that no one had ever really has challenged the Black Panther in, like, a long time because presumably, like, the Black Panther had been doing a good job, so not that many people really, like, felt like they had to challenge it. You can see, like, it's basically become, like, ritual at this point. And people were actually surprised when someone showed up to challenge him and block him. Like, you could tell that was something that really hadn't happened in a long time. Like, people had just going through motions. Like I mentioned earlier, the leadership unit has final say, not the individual king. So you see an example of this from the movie where T'Challa is not super willing to just do stuff without the council knowing. So even though he's the Black Panther, he still is in a sense, subject to the wishes of the council. And these councils were made by lineage heads chosen by the lineages based on seniority, wisdom, popularity, and vitality. So we see the different representatives of each of the tribes in Wakanda: the River Tribe, the Border Tribe, the Mining Tribe. I can't remember the other one off the top of my head, sorry. But you see how these councils like work and come to decisions by consensus. So they engage in deliberation until they reach a consensus. And that doesn't always mean like everybody 100% agrees with what's going on, but everybody's in general agreement about, okay, these are the steps that we're going to take and we're going to like see it out. And then, so we kind of going down to like the level of the individual now. So kind of Eric's psychology himself. So an important part of this is racial identity. So this is the significance and meaning that Black people place on race in defining themselves. So this could be how central race is to your overall concept. This could be just your positive and or negative feelings about your group membership. It could also be what you think other people view and think of your group. So it's not even just internally like what you think, but it also encompasses what you feel others think. So in this way, you see how identity isn't just an individual thing, but it's also informed by social relations. So we go back to the idea of I am because we are because I am. A person is also a person through their relationships. And we see how, because he's had these relationships that he was never able to develop with his family, he's disconnected, he's isolated, he's spiritually adrift, he's stuck in the apartment in the ancestral realm. And another part of racial identity would be racial ideology. So this would essentially be your philosophy on how people of your racial group should conduct themselves. And I included two quotes from two different scholars, both getting at how these racial ideologies can come from this experience you have of essentially having like a split or dual consciousness or a double consciousness. So this idea of not only having your own idea of yourself, but having to see yourself through other people's eyes, because it's always like made known and apparent to you. Like, it's one thing to develop your own sense of like your identity as a Black person because of your like experiences and like your cultural background, but it's another thing to also always be aware of like the negative stereotypes that are about Black people or like the history of like what's happened to you. And this is like Eric's story. This is why he has the particular ideology he has. He says, you know, I want to overthrow the oppressors. I want to overthrow like all those. I want to give people weapons to overthrow the people who enslaved them. That's part of his ideology. But it's also still wrapped up in his own like personal like trauma and personal experiences. And with the direction that he wants to go in terms of getting retribution or, you know, making those pay for who harmed him, it leads you to ask, well, what is even justice? What is justice? Because he's clearly looking for justice. But what is justice? How do you actually come to define what justice is, and how do you best get justice? And it makes me think about like restorative justice. So healing the harm to relationship and community, a proactive relational strategy to create cultural connectivity where everyone thrives and feels valued. So in a sense, like restorative justice would have been somebody going back to America and getting him, right? Like that would have been restorative justice, like not just leaving him there, like to deal with all that stuff like alone and basically as an weapon. And what would have happened if like, say he decides to not like let himself die? What would have been his fate? That's something that I always think about like every time I see these movies, like, you know what, you can lock, so like you want me to like not die, so you can just lock me up. But we don't know what their system is in Wakanda, do we? Like we don't know if they have prisons. Do we know if they have prisons? and you know, and we also clearly see that like if they wanted to help someone with psychological trauma, they are capable of doing it. So if you've seen Falcon and the Winter Soldier, you saw how like they basically healed Bucky, the Winter Soldier's like brainwashing. So if they can heal somebody's brainwashing who was an assassin that murdered a bunch of people, like I'm pretty sure that they could figure out something to do from like one of their own. So with restorative justice, it tends to be a threefold collaborative and dialogical process. So there's a relationship and there's a storytelling and relationship building. So, you know, people are telling their stories, but also building relationships with one another because it's an active process. You're not just waiting for things to get at their worst. You're constantly trying to like build and create relationships with people. There's also truth telling and accountability. So, you know, the truth has to be told and people have to be held accountable for what's going on in terms of like the wrong that you have done to someone and what action you need to take to repair it, which goes to reparative action. So how are you actually going to fix it? And this doesn't, and not like how you're going to punish someone, but how you're actually going to heal the community. Because punishment doesn't necessarily heal communities. Like sometimes it just creates just another open wound that people have to like deal with. So when someone is incarcerated, that's not just one person who gets thrown in jail. That's possibly a family that has been totally destabilized. Like, that's somebody who's not contributing to their community. That's somebody who's not able to pay the bills to like get food on the table. Like, there's different ways that punishment can destabilize like communities. And I think also like in previous episodes, back to like the example of Egypt. So Ma'at, the concept of cosmic and social justice, and these 7 different principles that make up this concept. So truth, balance, order, reciprocity, righteousness, justice, and harmony. So the ways in which these different factors, these different principles play off one another to create a harmonious society in which people are accountable to one another and accountable to one another, and also the ways in which people can order themselves and to have a sense of justice that people can like agree upon. So when justice is like literally personified as like a divine force, people are likely to take justice seriously, as opposed to just something that's just another thing. So like the idea that it's taking like a form of a deity shows how important like the idea of justice and these federal principles like reciprocity and harmony play in a society like Egypt. Which leads me to this broad question, like democratic living. How do we live with one another? And I'll just share like a short like excerpt. But this is from the book, Uses of Black Radicalism. And it's from the chapter, It's Hard to Stop Rebels That Time Travel. Democratic living constitutes life forms that actively seek independence from rulemaking. This ungovernability from below constantly threatens the unjust peace of dominant orders, including settler colonialism, racial capitalism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy. While contestations among the elites are frequent, they do not represent ungoverned and are quite different from the active refusal to be governed from below. So if we think about the ways in which people are always actively resisting rules being placed and enforced upon them, whether it's would-be tyrants like Eric, or even presumably good rulers like T'Challa. Like at some point, like monarch, at some point that might not be a good enough structure for everybody. Like having like a king. And if anyone's like familiar with the comics, like Ta-Nehisi Coates' run in Black Panther shows exactly this, like Wakanda revolts, and like T'Challa essentially has to sign a document saying that he's going to it's going to be a constitutional monarchy. So he was forced to make like an actual change by the people themselves because revolting like uprisings happened. So even like somebody like T'Challa isn't safe from the people deciding that they want something different. So how do we live with one another?
Dr. Thomas would like to throw the floor open for questions. He'll stay up here and I'll walk around with the microphone, okay? Does anybody want to ask a question of Dr. Thomas? Come on, don't be shy. You're not in my classroom anymore.
Is the mic on?
Should be.
Is it? Oh,
Yeah, it doesn't go through the house.
oh, okay. Okay. I found it interesting in your talk. You kind of compared the movie, how it goes from T'Challa's isolationism and his kind of acceptance of being more into the world, compared to America's kind of historical isolationism and our kind of taking more of a world stage. I was wondering, do you think that the movie Black Panther kind of goes beyond the American framework at the end? Because T'Challa does recognize that there's bad things in the past and he needs to do something now, but his solution really is like, let's build an outreach center in Oakland and announce to the UN what we're all about, and then I guess help people through money. You know, I guess what is your take on that?
Yeah, I didn't think it was much different. I mean, because that's why I say like Wakanda isn't just a story of African society, it could also be a story of American society. So, because, I mean, it was made, the director was American, it was made by an American company, the comic book itself is based in America, is written by Americans, like the whole Black Panther thing is mostly written by Americans. I mean, Stan Lee created Black Panther because he thought that little black children should have a black superhero. So, I mean, yeah, if a lot of it looks like America, I mean, because that's the context in which it came from, even though it's supposed to be a fictional African society.
But it doesn't really like go beyond kind of like what do we do next. It kind of seems like it caught up to where America kind of currently is. I guess that's my point.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
I agree, yeah. That was one thing I thought about too, it's like, okay, I mean, y'all building an outreach center, like, y'all got the most advanced technology in the world though.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Do you feel this has any correlation to can you find any correlation between the Black Panther that we've seen in Wakanda and then the Black Panther Party founded by Fred Hampton in Chicago?
So I think about that too because Eric is really like invoking some of that like history. So if you pay attention in the movie, I actually had that picture in the PowerPoint too. So the Huey Newton picture, you can actually see the poster of it in his room, in the apartment, and during the scene when he's in the ancestral realm, but also in the first scene where you see his father. So his father is clearly like inspired by the Black Panthers, and also it takes place in Oakland, which was like the headquarters of the Black Panthers under Huey Newton. So, I mean, the Black Panthers definitely are like an underlying like influence of like the Black Panther movie and particularly Eric himself. I mean, you can see like Eric himself as being like a Black Panther inspired by the Black Panther. So yeah, I like that question because I did like see that connection. So it's like, oh, they're gonna use new poster. It's like, oh, because of course, like a lot of some folks who weren't as familiar with the Black Panther movie, the Black Panther comic book when the movie came out, they hear Black Panther, they like, so y'all making a movie about the Black Panthers? Like I remember that. So it's like that's an association that a lot of people like had in their minds when they weren't as knowledgeable about the comic story. So I do see like the parallel between the Black Panther and the Black Panthers in terms of, you know, even just like the using the panther as like an icon itself is like it's too on the nose. Like it was so on the nose that that they actually changed the name of Black Panther in the comics to like Black Leopard for like a little hot second because they wanted to get confused with the Black Panthers because the Black Panther comic debuted in 1960s. I think.
Yeah, issues from the pages of Fantastic Four.
Yeah, and then the Black Panther Party was established in 1966. So it's literally within a year of each other that the organization and the comic book come out, and both of them are actually drawn from like the same thing to use the Panther. Because there was another organization that predates those Black Panthers that was a Black Panther party, but it wasn't like what we think of. It was like a predecessor that was formed in Alabama, I think. So they actually both like named themselves, like used the Black Panther name based off of this organization. So they even like, so it's even like using the same inspiration for like why they came up with that name. So it is a lot of like deep connection between like the comic book character and like the organization itself in terms of like why the use of like a panther and like the cultural iconography that plays off of, and how it ends up playing out in like the movie in terms of like incorporating like all that history into telling this Black Panther story in like the 21st century.
More questions? Yes? I mean, you are right there. I'll get to you in a second, Michaela.
Okay, I'll take it. So I love that you brought up the comics. There's tons of history there. With the sequel with the sequel coming in like, hopefully like next year, depending on how production goes, there's a lot of problems going on there. Where would you like to see them? Obviously, there's decades of history in the comics. Where would you like to see them change? Like, where would you want the sequel to go? What would you like to see out of like what you talked about here? What themes would you want them to expand on? What would you want to see there?
Okay. Oh man, thank you for that question. First of all, I just want to see more Wakanda. Like, just more Wakanda, like, so we can actually know what this place looks like. But also, like, I'm kind of interested to see like what the fallout is of T'Challa deciding to open up the doors, because he opens up the doors and what happens? Infinity War. Half of them get snapped out of existence. So like, how do people feel about that? That like, he opens up the doors, but also like enlists Wakanda into basically like this universe like spanning like war that like ends with half of the life in the universe getting snapped out of existence, including like Wakanda. So like, if people still feel the same way about T'Challa after all this, and especially after he's been gone for like 5 years and then it's gonna pop up talking about he's still the king, like, I want to see how that works out, but we, because Chadwick Boseman passed away, like, who knows, like, how that story is actually going to end up playing out, if that's the way they're going to go with it. So, yeah, I would have liked to see, like, I want to see more Wakanda, but also, like, I want to see, like, what the fallout is amongst the people in terms of both him opening up stuff and also, like, getting himself snapped out of existence for 5 years, along with him and Shuri. Like, that's like half the royal family right there. That's the king and the tech person. Like, that's a lot to deal with for 5 years and then having them just randomly reappear again.
I personally would like to know how it is that they all have the internet and yet the world doesn't know that Wakanda exists, because that is a bitchin' VPN right there. I also think that their Wi-Fi should be called Wakanda-Fi, but that's me.
Okay. So, fun fact, actually, because I follow Marvel a lot, I'm a huge Marvel fan. The director of the movie Black Panther did say that the next the next Black Panther movie will be showcasing a lot more of Wakanda. We'll get to see it as a whole, so that's awesome. But my question was going back to you talking about the Black Rebel Cyborg, and it immediately made me think of the DC character Cyborg. And so, do you believe that they are connected in that aspect, or what is your opinion on the black? Well, he's always been black, but the Cyborg in DC.
Dang. Oh, I really just thought about this when you asked that, because he also was like using like technology that's based from something that's not of this world. Mm-hmm. So like, he's really a black cyborg using technology that comes from like another planet, just like the Wakandans like enhanced their society and basically met themselves in cyborg because of like the lip marking that they have. That's some technology that's like implanted into them, like to make that happened. So yeah, like they make themselves cyborgs in a sense based using technology that comes from like the stars, using technology that's based on something that comes from the stars, basically. So both of them are examples of like cyborgs that augment themselves with technology based on something that's not of this world. So I like that connection. Like, yeah.
Okay.
We have more questions in the back. Let me get my steps in. Should have gotten a student to do this.
A non-smoking student. Hi, I really appreciate you bringing this out. And as a fan of the film and as a fan of domestic and Western-oriented politics, not necessarily an advocate of them, I'd like to propose this idea, and I want to ask you if this is reflected in the film, that the idea of Eric Killmonger as representing a radical views for change, as his father was abandoned for his views, represent the influence of the Black Panther Party and other nationalist party on the body politic of the 60s and 70s in the United States, and how their views were then incorporated partially into the future of the civil rights or black power movement, and how that also reflects Western governments, period, and how they deal with dissent, and then they incorporate some of that dissent into their progressive politics that follow. Thank you.
Damn, Bill.
I'm just, I'm processing.
It's like one of those questions that we have to answer to get our PhD, and it takes us 4 hours to answer it.
I'm trying to make sure I got like remember everything and like address all the
It's
points.
basically about the continuum of power. And when power is consolidated, how we tend to, it becomes generic. And it becomes middle of the road.
Right.
And we fight opposition to that power. And then we later incorporate it for its important aspects in what we create.
Right. Okay. I just got this in my mind. So I think about that in the sense when Eric, he has this like idea of like, oh, I'm like a radical, but he wants to be a king. And then how like even something like a radical praxis, once you like insert it into something that's not quite so radical, like a monarchy, like that gets subverted. So, so with Killmonger having like his inspiration from like the Black Panthers and also like the types of resistance that his father might have been like involved in as well too, we see how these ideologies play a role in both informing what people do in the future in terms of like future radical politics, but like you said, with the co-optation of these like strategies by less radical forces, we see how, the rhetoric of like the Black Panthers ended up in a movie, but the Black Panther could be in and of itself like a form of that, like a recuperation of like those radical ideas. So like those radical ideas get put in the movie, and then they get framed as the ideas of like the villain. So even though like they had a radical, even though they initially have like a radical undertone or a radical motivation, because he decides to do things through like the military-industrial complex, or he decides to be a soldier, he decides to, like he said, go participate in these wars where he's literally killing people like who look like him, and the ways in which his radical politics are literally subverted by the different strategies he tries to take to get his justice. And with relates to like the Black Panthers too, like how much of what they did ended up hitting or staying relevant within social movements, and how much of it became only aesthetics. So like how many people like remember like the actual ideology of the Panthers versus the people who remember all like the aesthetic cool stuff, because the Panthers also look cool. But when that's all that people remember, when the history gets diluted through both co-optation of these radical forces, but also like misrepresentation and miseducation about these groups, you can see how someone like Eric, even with his like motivation to do radical work, he only knows what he can do based off of the society in which he lives in. So his radical efforts were always going to be subverted based off of the route that he took. And that concentration of power that he tries to then like have to like make the world his own image is often why like charismatic leaders are like the downfall of organizations and like social movements, because they get in their head that they know what's best and everyone else kind of like falls behind, and like it becomes about like sustaining like the leader or the charismatic leader rather than like the organization itself. So when power becomes too concentrated in the hands of one individual, things go bad, whether it's Huey Newton going like off the wall when he starts getting too much power, when it gets into his head, like as the leader of the Black Panthers, him and Eldridge Cleaver having beef like openly on TV, like while people are watching. It's like, what are y'all doing? Like y'all getting too involved like y'all own like stuff, like, or like Killmonger saying like the sun will never set on the Wakandan Empire. If you're talking about overthrowing oppressors, then why are you invoking the name of possibly one of the biggest oppressors in history, which is the British Empire that conquered and dominated so many people over its time? I hope that answers like your question. I hope that answers your question. I tried to get to as much as I could.
We have any other questions for Dr. Jones? Yeah, you can double it.
Yeah. The first one is about the music choice. Do you think Kendrick Lamar was the best person to be over the soundtrack and the TDE family, excluding 2 Chainz and Travis Scott?
I'll just answer this question. What if Drake did the soundtrack?
Whoa.
Oh! Yes, Kendrick was the best person to do the soundtrack. Also, like, he's from Oakland, California.
Right.
Which is also where the movie
The
takes
director
place.
is also
so, like,
from
the Oakland, California connection, like,
the director.
He's the best person to like to create a soundtrack for this movie, because he knows the world. He grew up in the world that Eric did.
Right.
Like, when he's saying like, and they keep repeating throughout the album, like, I am the child, I am Killmonger.
Right.
So he's actually like openly identifying with these characters, because he's in many ways lived like the life of somebody like Eric. Like, he lived in Oakland, California. He's probably about the same age as Eric. For all we knew, he could have been one of the little homies that Eric was playing with in the basketball court.
Right. And my second question is about the Dora Milaje. So do you feel like, because in Wakanda, the Dora Milaje is seen as the generals, they protect the king, they protect the Wakanda itself. Do you feel like that when the director or the writers made it, they challenged the idea that women can also be in power over a society such as Wakanda? Because we see that most of the time, because there was the men, whoever the Wakabi was over, there are men too who help protect, and they are the army as well. But do you think that it was a challenge or a different ideology that the women were more in power over Wakanda than the men were?
Maybe not, but maybe it looks like more because you compare it to America.
Right.
But like if you particularly compare it to like other Marvel movies, like they definitely got more power like in Wakanda than in any of these other movies. Like because if you compare all the movies, like line them up, like how much do men and women really participate or speak in the movies?
Right. Black Widow, she doesn't have any power. She just has a gun. She's an assassin.
Yeah, really,
versus
Black Widow was like in Black Panther.
Right.
Like the Avengers got 1, T'Challa got like 5 of them.
Right.
Like, so there's a good point about how like it shows like women having more power in this society, like Wakanda. And if you look in the ancestral realm, you can see like when he's talking to all the previous Panthers, you see women who are also the previous Panthers. So you kind of, if you're paying attention, you can actually see like throughout the history there have been women who were the Black Panther, and this is why like in the comics she ends up becoming the Black Panther, and why people thought or thinking that she still might be in the next movie, because it's been a part of their history that women are as equally capable as men in Wakanda, and that's not even just only Wakanda. Like you can see that across different African societies in which power can be run through matrilineal lines. So you have the Queen Mother. So like the Queen Mother is like a role that clearly shows that women still have that women can have a powerful voice in the government, because there's literally a role for her as the mother. And like she is like listened to, and she is an active member of the council, just like all the other heads. And some of the other heads of the council are also women, which means that they were elected and selected by their tribes to represent them on these councils. So, yeah, not even just the Dora Milaje, but like the other council members are like an indication of the role that women play in Wakanda. And I was kind of excited for the next movie too, because maybe it's going to be based something like the comic world of Wakanda that was focused only on the Dora Milaje. So, I mean, hopefully they keep going with it, like the next movie and the next movie after, the next movie after, how many they decide to do that. Right. They keep this theme going, because like it was refreshing, like compared to all the other Marvel movies, like in terms of like the role that women played in the movie, particularly Black women. So.
Yeah. Oh, yes, please.
You haven't gone at all.
Oh, okay. Well, mine kind of goes off of the soundtrack, like she said. Oh, okay. It kind of goes off the soundtrack. So a lot of like you said, the movie was based off of a lot of American people made the movie. So do you feel as if the soundtrack had more of an African culture effect on it or not?
I think it did, because Kendrick didn't just make all the songs by himself. Like he curated the album, so he did record like a few of the songs and like makes an appearance on some of the songs, but he also like brought in other artists to perform like songs too that were like more rooted in the culture. So it promotes like the authenticity of it by like having not just like the American rapper like record all the songs, but also like having to invite like different people on from different like areas of the world to like participate too. So if it was just only him recording songs on the album, I'd be like, yeah, it's good, but like it probably doesn't have enough of what it needs to really hit. But because he like actually invited other people, not just himself, to like perform songs on the album, like he get that problem gets kind of accounted for, because he's not doing it all himself.
Okay, I have two questions, but they're one's short. Okay. The first one, I guess, is what do you think of space operas and African characters who are either like in an ensemble or a majority of the cast, and how they reflect on contemporary African societies?
I like the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. You asked about space opera. I like space movies in general, like science fiction, like I'm a science fiction fan. I was hoping that because I've read the comics, like I have like a whole bunch of like wild ideas about where this could possibly go in these movies. So like, you know, in the comics they even talked about how like Wakanda expanding like out into the galaxy. So I'm interested to see if anybody from Wakanda is gonna go out into space, because there's actually a recent run of, it's a comic called The Ultimates, but it's basically like a multiverse spanning team. Well, team that travels the multiverse is Black Panther, Captain Marvel, and like 3 or 4 other like superheroes, and they just go around the cosmos like just fixing like the multiverse. So like, yeah, I want to see Black Panther in space.
My second one, do you have any other like Afrofuturistic media, whether books or movies or anything that you would recommend, I guess, to people?
I actually have a reference page at the end. So here some. anything that's written by Octavia Butler, I don't even, these were like the references I used for this specific presentation, but like, Octavia Butler is basically like the mother of Afrofuturism. Like, so anything from Octavia Butler, Janelle Monáe's music, like that's Afrofuturism like all over. Funny thing, when I was a freshman in Morehouse, she actually came to promote her first album, and she did a listen through and she explained the whole album to us as she. It's okay because I'm like, this before she like blew up. So like, you know, I was like, wow, this is some dope stuff. But yeah, so like Janelle Monáe, like she's an example of someone who does like a lot of Afrofuturism in her music and work. I kind of want to throw in Get Out. Maybe not as like pure Afrofuturism, but something that kind of plays with some of those things. Like the idea of like the sunken place. Like the sunken place sounds kind of like another version of like what Eric is dealing with in terms of like being like disconnected from like his his ancestral background, from like his people, from like his like knowledge, like the way that what's his name? Kristen, Get Out.
Oh God. Man. I know the same guy was also in Black Panther.
Man, that's a shame. But like when somebody gets put into the sunken place, like their body is like taken over by a foreign presence. Like it's them, but it ain't them. So in a way, you can see like Eric's like isolation and like alienation from like his self, like his family, familiar history, being something similar to like the sunken place in Get Out, where like a person is literally like disassociated from their actual body. So that'd be one example of that. Our Robot would be an example of Afrofuturism. Yeah, like I like that. I like Our Robot too.
Watch me.
Oh, the new one?
Yeah.
I haven't. When I saw that they had that social scene, and I was like, I don't know if I'm trying to watch something like that right now. Like I'm gonna need to like check that one out. Like I ain't gonna watch it, but I need to like let it like go through.
What about J-Live?
I haven't seen that one, and also Will Smith's movies have been like real hit or miss lately.
How many Will Smith movies are Afrofuturist?
Oh, that's a good question. He could have been Neo in the Matrix. He turned it down to do Wild
That's true, he did. I even though it is not Afrofuturist,
Yeah. I mean, I guess the question with like Afrofuturism is, if it's Afrofuturism, is how much is African culture actually like in? I don't know how, where I take Sun Ra, for like the musical artist Sun Ra, like all of his like wild and crazy like jazz music, like I actually have like one of his albums like records, and like the way in which he used like different sounds to like create like an aesthetic that's both it's somehow both ancient and futuristic, because he would dress up in like Egyptian like garb, like so like ancient Egyptian garb, but you would tell people like he was from another planet. So he created his like whole mythology around himself as like an outer space being who was here to like tell people like, you know, this life that you're living is really like fake, basically. So he almost like used himself as like an Afrofuturist product to like communicate like his message to like the world, like his music.
Do we have any more questions? I'd also recommend that documentary series you showed me, Henry Louis Gates, on the history of African empires and kingdoms. Remember that? What was that called?
Great African Civilization.
Yeah, watch that. It's on Prime. It's really good. But do we have any other questions? Y'all doing a good job.
So you're a fellow comic reader, and this is something that's been happening for a long time. What I wanted to know kind of your thoughts on taking white characters in the comics and then switching their race, I, for one, fully support it because comics are always changing. There's always new writers coming in. But whenever this happens, there's always controversy. And I kind of wanted to know what you thought about that. Or conversely, what would happen if, like, somehow, some way it was greenlit that you could change the race of a black character to a white character. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm gonna use Spider-Man as an example. I like Peter Parker. I like Miles Morales. There's room for both. We didn't have 50 million movies about Peter Parker, so can we have like a few more about Miles? So like, it doesn't. I don't feel like it has to be an either or, especially with these comic book characters that are like legacy roles. So like Captain America, like it getting passed down from Steve to Sam because Steve Rogers literally loses his superpowers and he turns into an old man. So he literally can't be Captain America no more. Somebody's got to be Captain America. And who better to be Captain America than Captain America's best friend? So, you know, it doesn't, like those stories can work if they're done right and, you know, and also people get really defensive about like they comic book characters and like the people that they feel, the characters that they feel like theirs. Like you're taking away something from me. But it's also like, y'all, nothing sticks in comics, like it's gonna change right back. How many times they killed Superman and brought him back? How many times they killed like a bunch of different people and brought him back to life? Like this stuff don't stick.
How many times did they blow up the earth?
How many times they blowing up the earth? In the Marvel comics, like the universe has ended like 7 times already. Like, don't none of that stick. So like, I understand why people get defensive or get upset around that stuff, but it's also like, if you really mad about it, like, wait a year.
Do we have any more questions? No? Some of you can double dip if you like. Well, all right then. Why don't we give one final round of applause to Dr. Thomas? Thank you for coming, and thank you all for coming. If you did not slide the card reader, go and do that, because it's how your professors will know that you've been here, except for all the ones that I teach. I know you've been here, but still do it.